I thought it was just a routine checkup. Then she locked the door and everything changed. It started like any ordinary day. I had an appointment scheduled at the clinic, nothing more than a routine checkup. I arrived slightly early, fidgeting with my jacket, trying to calm the quiet tension that always seemed to accompany me in these sterile environments. The faint antiseptic scent and the muted hum of fluorescent lights made me feel oddly detached from the world, like I was stepping into a place where everything had its designated rhythm, and I was just a small part of it. Then she appeared. My nurse. I had seen her name on the schedule before, but I had never met her in person. When she walked in, there was an immediate presence, a calm confidence that made everything else fade slightly into the background. She was in her early 40s, graceful in a way that didn't demand attention but naturally drew it. Her uniform fit impeccably, but it was the way she moved, precise yet fluid, that made the space around her feel warmer, softer. "Good morning," she said, her voice low and smooth, carrying a hint of warmth that seemed almost personal. I offered a small smile in return, unsure of why my pulse had already picked up. She guided me through the usual formalities, asking questions about my health, noting down my responses. But there was a subtle difference this time. When she reached to take my pulse, her hand lingered slightly longer than necessary on my wrist. I felt the warmth of her skin against mine and the gentle pressure as she positioned my hand correctly. My mind raced. A tiny spark of something I didn't quite understand stirred inside me. Her eyes met mine as she asked a question about my recent sleep patterns. There was an almost imperceptible pause, a depth in her gaze that suggested she saw more than just the surface. I found myself caught in that moment, trying to respond coherently while feeling an inexplicable pull toward her presence. As she moved to check my temperature, her hair brushed the side of my cheek, soft and warm. The sensation made me acutely aware of every detail: the gentle sway of her body, the faint scent of her perfume, the quiet rhythm of her movements. Even the clinical sterility of the room seemed softened somehow by her presence. I realized then that this wasn't just another routine checkup. There was something different in the way she carried herself, the way she interacted, the subtle attention she gave. It was as if she had noticed my nervousness from the start and had chosen, silently, to ease it, to connect in a way that felt both professional and unexpectedly intimate. Even in these first moments, I sensed the tension beneath the surface, a quiet energy that hummed between us. My thoughts wandered to possibilities I didn't dare voice, to a closeness I didn't expect to feel in a sterile clinic room. Something in the air had changed. And though nothing overt had happened yet, I knew, instinctively, that this appointment would be unlike any I had ever experienced before. After the initial checkup, the room seemed quieter than usual. The faint hum of medical machines and the distant murmur of staff in the hallway felt almost distant, as if the world outside this small clinic room had paused. I tried to focus on the paperwork she was filling out, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being unusually aware of her presence. Every movement she made, reaching for a clipboard, adjusting a pen, straightening the edge of the examination bed, felt deliberate and somehow mesmerizing. Then she turned toward me, her eyes locking with mine in a way that sent a subtle jolt through my chest. She spoke softly, almost in a whisper. "Now just you and me in the room." Her words were simple, clinical on the surface, but the way she said them carried a warmth, an intimacy I hadn't anticipated. Before I could respond, I realized the door had clicked shut behind her. The soft yet definite sound resonated in the otherwise quiet room. For a moment, a flash of panic ran through me. Is this appropriate? What's happening? But that feeling was quickly replaced by curiosity, an almost magnetic pull toward her. There was a confidence in her stance, a subtle calm in her expression, that somehow reassured me despite the unusual circumstances. She didn't speak again immediately, but the silence was not empty. It was charged, heavy with unspoken tension and possibilities. I noticed every detail: The way her uniform clung gently at her waist, the graceful tilt of her shoulder as she leaned slightly toward me, the small sparkle in her eyes as she observed my reactions. The air between us seemed warmer, the faint scent of her perfume enveloping me in a subtle, comforting haze. Even the sterile white walls of the clinic faded into the background, replaced by the vivid awareness of her presence. Then came the first touch, not overt, not intentional in an obvious sense, but enough to make my heart skip a beat. She guided my hand to adjust the pillow, her fingers brushing mine lightly. That brief contact lingered in my mind, the warmth of her skin, the delicate pressure, leaving a trace of electricity that I couldn't ignore. My body reacted before my mind did, a mixture of tension and anticipation twisting together, leaving me acutely aware of every movement she made. We exchanged few words, yet every glance, every small gesture, felt loaded with meaning. I realized how much I was noticing her, the subtle arch of her brow, the quiet rhythm of her breathing, the way her eyes seemed to track me without forcing attention. Each observation deepened a strange, quiet connection that made the room feel almost private, intimate, in a way that was impossible to explain. By the time she stepped closer, adjusting the equipment near my side, I was aware that nothing would ever feel the same in this room again. Something between us had shifted, not in a loud, dramatic way, but quietly, almost imperceptibly, like the first tremor before a calm storm. And I knew, deep down, that this simple moment, a closed door, a whispered phrase, a brush of skin, was the beginning of something far more complicated, far more human, and far more impossible to ignore. The air in the room felt heavier now, charged with a quiet tension I couldn't quite name. She moved around me with the same careful grace I had noticed before, but now every motion seemed intentional, almost magnetic. I was aware of her presence in ways that made my pulse quicken, the way her hair fell softly around her shoulders, the subtle scent of her perfume lingering in the space between us, the warmth radiating from her body as she bent slightly to adjust the clipboard. Then it happened. She reached for my hand, gently taking it in hers. I froze. My mind went blank for a moment, caught between instinctive hesitation and an unexpected comfort. Her hand was warm, soft, and strong in a way that felt reassuring. I could feel the faint pulse of her fingertips against my skin, a rhythm that somehow seemed to echo my own heartbeat. There was a pause, a long, deliberate moment where neither of us spoke. I realized how aware I was of her every movement, every small gesture. The subtle squeeze of her hand, the way her thumb brushed lightly across the back of my hand, conveyed more than words ever could. There was a quiet intimacy in the touch, something tender yet charged with unspoken emotion. My thoughts raced, half in disbelief at the audacity of the moment, half in awe of the unexpected warmth it brought. I felt a strange mix of vulnerability and exhilaration. This was more than a routine checkup, more than professional courtesy. It was a bridge between us, a first step into a closeness that had been silently building since I walked into the clinic. Her eyes met mine, steady and soft, and for the first time, I noticed the subtle depth behind her gaze. There was understanding there, a recognition of something unspoken between us. I didn't need her to say anything. The connection was already palpable, like an invisible thread pulling us together. Every muscle in my body seemed to tense with anticipation, yet simultaneously relax under the gentle pressure of her hand. Even in this small act, I could feel the weight of the moment. Her closeness, the warmth of her skin against mine, the subtle scent of her presence. It was all too much to ignore, and yet I couldn't look away. I realized how much I wanted to stay in that space, to linger in the intimacy of something unspoken but deeply felt. The room, still softly lit and quiet, became a private world of its own. The clinical surroundings faded, replaced by the sensation of her hand in mine, the magnetic pull of her gaze, and the realization that this first touch was more than accidental. It was a promise of something deeper, a slow, deliberate invitation into a connection neither of us fully understood yet, but both felt urgently. In that quiet, suspended moment, I understood that everything was shifting. This simple, nonverbal gesture, her hand in mine, had altered the atmosphere between us entirely. The tension that had been building since my arrival was no longer subtle. It was tangible, a quiet electricity that hummed beneath the surface, promising that nothing in this room would ever feel ordinary again. After that first lingering touch, the room felt smaller, warmer, and somehow more private. Every sound seemed amplified, the soft hum of the medical equipment, the quiet rustle of her uniform, even the subtle rhythm of our breathing. I became acutely aware of her presence beside me, of how her body seemed to occupy the space in a way that drew my attention without trying. She motioned toward the bed, her voice gentle. "Let's adjust this so you're comfortable." There was nothing clinical about the way she said it. It was soft, caring, and carried an intimacy I hadn't expected. I hesitated, but there was a quiet trust that had formed between us in the previous moments. I allowed her to guide me, sitting close as she helped me settle. The closeness was natural, unforced, yet it sent a subtle ripple through me, a mixture of tension, curiosity, and something deeper I couldn't yet name. As she leaned over to adjust the pillow behind my back, her hair brushed my cheek softly. The sensation was fleeting, almost accidental, yet it left an indelible impression. My skin tingled at the gentle touch, and I became painfully aware of the warmth radiating from her body. It wasn't something overtly sensual. It was simply human, the natural closeness of two people occupying the same small space with mutual care. Her hands lingered for just a moment longer than necessary, smoothing the pillow as she straightened up. I noticed the subtle curve of her shoulder, the quiet strength in her posture, and the faint, reassuring weight of her hand as it rested briefly near mine. There was a rhythm to her movements that was almost hypnotic, and I found myself drawn in, my attention fully captured by the small, deliberate gestures that carried an unspoken tenderness. We shared few words, but the silence was heavy with meaning. Every glance, every subtle shift in position, felt charged. I noticed how her eyes softened when she looked at me, how she seemed to measure my comfort and tension with a careful precision that made me feel simultaneously seen and cherished. The room, once clinical and detached, had transformed into a cocoon of intimacy where the outside world no longer mattered. I became aware of my own reactions, the quickening of my pulse, the slight tremor in my hands, the way my chest felt both light and tight at once. It was a curious, almost disorienting mix of emotions, comfort, anticipation, nervousness, and a deepening fascination with her. Even a small brush of her fingers against mine, an accidental touch as she adjusted the bed, sent a shiver through me, a quiet reminder of the unspoken tension building between us. In that close proximity, I realized the dynamic between us had changed irreversibly. There was a new intimacy, not yet named, not yet defined, but undeniable. Her presence was no longer just professional, it was personal, human, and quietly magnetic. I understood then that this slow, subtle build of closeness was laying the foundation for something far more profound, a connection that neither of us could ignore, even if we tried. And in that moment, as she leaned just a little closer, I felt it clearly. The emotional gravity between us was growing stronger, pulling us toward a closeness that would change everything. The quiet closeness between us had been building for several minutes, though it felt like hours. Every glance, every subtle movement, every accidental brush of her hand had amplified the tension in the room. I was hyper-aware of her presence, the gentle warmth radiating from her, the soft rustle of her uniform as she adjusted her position, even the faint, comforting scent of her perfume. The clinic, once sterile and impersonal, now seemed charged with an almost intimate electricity. She noticed it too. I could tell from the slight tilt of her head, the softening of her eyes, the way her body seemed to lean just a fraction closer. And then, in a gesture that felt both natural and deliberate, she reached for me. "You seem tense," she said softly, her voice carrying that gentle, soothing tone that made my chest tighten with anticipation. Before I could respond, she opened her arms, inviting me into a hug. I hesitated for just a fraction of a second, the conflict between propriety and the undeniable pull of comfort holding me in place. But then I felt the sincerity in her gesture, the quiet reassurance in her eyes, and I relaxed, letting myself lean into her embrace. The hug was brief, yet it held a weight I hadn't expected. Her arms encircled me with gentle firmness, her hands resting lightly on my shoulders and upper back. I felt the warmth of her body against mine, a comforting presence that seemed to quiet the rapid thoughts racing through my mind. Her closeness was grounding, a safe harbor in the otherwise clinical world we occupied. Even the smallest details stood out vividly: the softness of her uniform against my skin, the subtle rise and fall of her chest as she breathed, the quiet rhythm of her heartbeat beneath her shirt. I noticed how her fingers lingered for a moment longer than necessary, the gentle pressure a silent acknowledgement of the tension I hadn't even realized I carried. In that embrace, there was no rush, no sense of urgency, only the slow, deliberate intimacy of two people sharing a moment of connection. I became acutely aware of the power of touch, not in a physical or sexual sense, but in its ability to convey trust, comfort, and unspoken emotion. The hug spoke volumes without a single word. It communicated understanding, empathy, and a quiet invitation into a deeper bond. I felt myself relax into her warmth, my muscles softening as the initial shock of closeness gave way to a gentle calm. There was a strange, almost dizzying mixture of sensations: comfort, curiosity, longing, and a tender awareness of the unspoken feelings simmering beneath the surface. My heartbeat slowed just slightly, yet my mind was alight with possibilities, each one tethered to the magnetic presence of the woman holding me. When we finally pulled back, our eyes met, lingering in a shared understanding. Neither of us needed to speak, the hug had said everything. It was a moment of pure emotional intimacy, a first step across the invisible boundary that had existed between us since the appointment began. I realized, with a quiet, thrilling certainty, that this connection was real, profound, and utterly transformative. That hug changed everything. It marked the point where the dynamic between us shifted irreversibly, opening the door to a closeness neither of us had expected but both were beginning to feel deeply. The room felt suspended in time. After the hug, everything had shifted. Our closeness was no longer just physical, it had seeped into the unspoken, delicate layers of emotion between us. She moved with the same gentle grace as before, but now there was an added softness to her presence, a hint of vulnerability that made me notice every subtle detail more acutely. The slight curve of her lips as she thought, the way her eyes lingered on mine just a fraction longer than necessary, the quiet catch in her breath when our hands brushed. She settled beside me on the edge of the bed, sitting close but not overwhelming, giving me space while still radiating warmth. Her voice, soft and low, broke the silence. "I've never had a patient, or anyone really, make me feel this way," she admitted. There was no embarrassment in her tone, only honesty, the kind of openness that made it impossible not to listen closely. I swallowed, my own heart racing in response. I wanted to speak, to say something profound, but the words seemed inadequate, clumsy against the weight of what she had just revealed. Instead, I let my gaze linger on her, noticing the slight tension in her shoulders, the way she seemed to brace herself while still leaning just a little closer. There was courage in her vulnerability, and it pulled me forward, quieting the nervous thoughts in my mind. I feel calm around you," I finally admitted, my voice softer than I intended. "More than I've felt with anyone in a long time." Saying it aloud made my chest feel light and heavy all at once, the strange combination of relief and anticipation sending a shiver down my spine. She smiled faintly, a small, knowing curve of her lips, and for a moment the room felt like the only place that existed. Our hands brushed again, a gentle, accidental contact that neither of us immediately withdrew from. It was a quiet, unspoken reassurance, a tether connecting us through the tension and the honesty we were sharing. I noticed her eyes glimmer slightly, the subtle warmth that radiated from her making it almost impossible to look away. The atmosphere was charged, not with drama, but with something profoundly human, mutual recognition of feelings that had been simmering beneath the surface, now finding space to breathe. She leaned just a fraction closer, and I could feel the faint warmth of her hair against my shoulder. The nearness wasn't overwhelming, it was comforting, grounding, and electric all at once. Words were secondary to the connection we were forging, the quiet acknowledgement of attraction, care, and understanding that flowed between us. It was a slow dance of emotions, hesitant, deliberate, and entirely consuming. For the first time, I realized that what was happening between us was more than fleeting curiosity or fleeting tension. It was a real, tangible bond forming in the small moments. The way she noticed my discomfort, the way she reassured me through touch and presence, the honesty in her voice that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't before. We didn't need to say more. The glance we shared, the brief interlacing of fingers, the quiet rhythm of our breathing, it said everything. In that moment, I understood that this connection, born from unexpected intimacy and trust, had changed us both. And even though the future was uncertain, the emotional weight of this shared vulnerability made one thing undeniably clear: neither of us could ignore the pull between us. The room had grown quiet again, but now it was different, softer, warmer, charged with the subtle electricity of everything that had passed between us. After the quiet confessions, the shared glances, and the lingering touches, the dynamic between us had shifted irrevocably. The clinical sterility of the room seemed almost secondary to the human connection that had quietly taken root. I could feel her presence beside me as palpably as my own heartbeat, a comforting weight that filled the small space with warmth. She leaned slightly back, her fingers brushing mine in a subtle, lingering gesture that carried more meaning than words ever could. Her eyes met mine, steady, soft, and unflinching, as if daring me to acknowledge the undeniable bond forming between us. The quiet intimacy of that moment was almost overwhelming, not because of anything overtly romantic, but because of the depth of emotional trust we had built in such a short span of time. She began softly, her voice almost a whisper. I didn't expect this. I didn't expect to feel this. Her words hung in the air, unfinished but heavy with meaning. I didn't need her to finish. I understood completely. The shared smiles, the subtle brush of hands, the lingering warmth of her presence, all of it spoke of a connection deeper than either of us had anticipated. I swallowed, feeling my chest tighten in response. I know, I admitted, my voice low and steady, though my pulse still raced. I feel it too. More than I ever imagined I could in a place like this. There was no rush, no pressure, just honesty, mutual recognition, and the quiet thrill of shared vulnerability. We remained close, letting the tension settle into something gentle and profound. The soft hum of the equipment in the background became a rhythm for our unspoken understanding. I noticed the small details again, the warmth of her shoulder near mine, the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air, the subtle curve of her lips as she offered a small, knowing smile. Each moment felt sacred, weighted with the knowledge that we had crossed an invisible threshold, stepping into a new, uncharted territory together. Then, almost instinctively, we allowed a final, lingering touch, our fingers intertwining briefly, a simple act that encapsulated everything we had felt, everything we hadn't said. It was a promise, not of the future, but of the present, an acknowledgement that this connection was real, meaningful, and transformative. As she finally stood, giving me a soft, reassuring smile, the room felt full in a way it never had before. I realized that whatever came next, whether we explored this connection further or simply carried its memory with us, this moment had changed us irrevocably. I felt a quiet joy, a sense of being truly seen and understood, and a warmth that would linger long after the door was opened and the world outside resumed its normal pace. When the door finally opened, we exchanged a lingering glance, a subtle touch of hands, and then stepped back into our respective worlds. The tension, the curiosity, the intimacy, all remained, transformed into a quiet, enduring bond. And even if nothing else changed that day, I knew one thing for certain: nothing in my life, or hers, would ever feel quite ordinary again. If this story made your heart race and your cheeks warm, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell, so you won't miss the next slow burn romance that will leave you breathless.